Belfast, late in the 20th century. Picture the street as it actually is. Terraced houses sitting close to the pavement, front doors that open directly onto the footpath, net curtains that move without wind. Children play at one end. At the other, a man reads a newspaper in a parked car that has been there for 40 minutes and hasn't moved. Everybody on the street has registered that car. This is the surveillance environment that forced Britain's plainclothes intelligence operators to rethink everything about who could do the work. Every face reads every other face. IRA counter-surveillance networks in Republican Belfast were trained, organised and woven into the fabric of daily life. Telephone engineers on the IRA payroll monitored security force communications. Council workers reported unusual vehicles. Housewives on certain streets knew the registration numbers of cars that didn't belong. The information moved through pubs, churches, schools, and front doors, and it moved fast. A male soldier trying to blend into this environment carried visible problems from the start. Military training produces a specific physical awareness, a way of scanning a space, of standing so that your back is rarely to an entrance, of watching without appearing to watch, and it's almost impossible to switch off. British Army physical culture of that era produced men with particular haircuts, particular postures, a way of carrying themselves under pressure. When a new face appeared on a Republican street, it was assessed immediately. Does this person belong here? Do their clothes, their walk, their idle behaviour fit the way people actually live on this road? Getting the answer wrong had a body count. Between 1971 and the mid-1980s, 84 security force members were killed in the Crossmaglen and Fork Hill areas of South Armagh alone. The IRA's South Armagh Brigade was assessed by British military intelligence as one of the most aggressive and operationally sophisticated units the Provisional IRA had fielded anywhere. One active service unit in that area seemed able to identify, track and kill soldiers operating in what appeared to be civilian cover with a consistency that suggested its counter-surveillance capability was genuinely advanced. After the British Army erected 10 hilltop observation posts in South Armagh in 1986, the casualty rate in those areas fell to roughly a third of what it had been. Fixed, elevated observation reduced exposure. But the fundamental problem remained. The closer an operator had to get to a target, the more completely the cover story had to hold. And for a man who looked like a British soldier trying not to look like a British soldier, that cover story had structural weaknesses that physical training couldn't fully address. The British Army's first attempt at a dedicated covert surveillance unit was the Military Reaction Force, the MRF, operational from roughly 1971 to 1973. The MRF ran plainclothes operators through Republican areas of Belfast, gathering intelligence and monitoring suspects. One of its operations used a laundry service as cover. A van collected washing from Republican households, and the collected material was analysed for weapons residue while the customers were photographed and catalogued. It was a genuinely effective piece of tradecraft. Records identify her as Lance Corporal Sarah Jane Walk of the British Army. The four-square laundry worked until it didn't. The IRA turned 2 MRF double agents and extracted enough information to identify the operation. On the 2nd of October 1972, an IRA unit ambushed the laundry van on the Twinbrook estate. The operation was blown, the MRF was compromised, and by early 1973, the unit had been stood down. The MRF's failure demonstrated something structural. Covert surveillance in Northern Ireland required a different kind of selection. a different kind of training, and a fundamentally different answer to the question of which human beings could move through a hostile community without triggering its defenses. The successor unit would need to think about that question in ways the MRF never had. 14 Intelligence Company was formally deployed to Northern Ireland by the British Army's headquarters in the province in 1973. 3 detachments were established. 1 covered Londonderry and the north, 1 covered Mid-Ulster, 1 covered Belfast. The unit was commanded at lieutenant colonel level, and SAS officers were central to its early formation, developing the selection and training program that became 14 INT. The unit's name changed multiple times as a deliberate counterintelligence measure. Special Reconnaissance Unit, Intelligence and Security Group, 14 Intelligence and Security Company, 14 Intelligence Company. On the ground, it was always the Det. Its insignia depicted a peacock with a scroll reading Argus, Argus Panoptes, the 100-eyed giant of Greek mythology who couldn't be fully blinded. The unit's identity was built around the idea of watching. The Det watched. The SAS struck. That division describes the entire operational logic of the unit, and understanding it changes how you read the story. A Det operator's job was to follow a suspect for weeks without being noticed, to enter a building in the early hours and leave no trace, to sit in a static observation post for hours, photographing the comings and goings of a weapons cache, to tail a car through the back streets of Andersonstown or the narrow roads of South Armagh without making eye contact with anyone who shouldn't see them. When the intelligence was sufficient, it was passed up the chain. The Det created the conditions for the ambushes and arrests. It didn't conduct them. In May 1987, an SAS operation designated Operation Judy killed 8 IRA East Tyrone Brigade members at Loch Gall, County Armagh. The brigade's leadership, including Patrick Kelly, the officer commanding, and Padraig McKerney and Jim Liner, who had been the unit's strategic architects, was destroyed in a single evening. It was the single largest loss of IRA life in a day during the entire conflict. A 9th person, Anthony Hughes, a civilian bystander who was driving through Loch Gall that evening with no connection to the operation underway, was also killed. The intelligence chain that made the ambush possible included 14 Intelligence Company operators driving the back roads around Loch Gall before the strike, surveilling the East Tyrone unit's reconnaissance of the target. Surveillance preceded the killing. That was the design. Selection for the Det drew from all 3 armed services: Army, Navy, Air Force. Candidates were summoned to a 1-day assessment, then invited by Ministry of Defence letter to begin the full course if they passed. The 6-month training programme covered advanced driving, including controlled crashes and anti-ambush procedures, covert photography, including night infrared work, surveillance techniques from vehicle-mounted observation to foot follow and static ditching, weapons handling up to assault rifle standard, unarmed combat, and the practical tradecraft of breaking and entering, picking locks, copying keys, planting devices, leaving no trace. One selection course drew around 1,000 applicants. 17 were ultimately deployed to Northern Ireland. Selection was open regardless of gender. Women could formally serve in a Special Forces adjacent unit on equal selection terms with men, undergoing the same physical tests, the same intellectual assessments, the same sleep deprivation and navigational exercises. The standard sidearm for Det operators was the Browning High Power. Female operators with smaller hands were sometimes issued the Volta PPK, smaller, more concealable under certain clothing. That is evidence of a unit solving for the specific physical requirements of its female operators, not simply accommodating their presence. After the previous video in this series covered 14 Intelligence Company, viewers who had read the primary sources started pointing at a gap. 3 comments matter. A viewer posting as Peter Dawson F5Z wrote that there was another book about 14 int the video hadn't addressed, titled She Who Dared, published in 1999. 8 people agreed with a like. A commenter called Dark Nemesis 4300 named the book explicitly and noted that Sarah Ford had not been the only female det operator to publish. A third commenter, PSL POM, went further. A name had been wrong in the source material the video used. The surname in question was Walk, not Walker, referring to the female soldier connected to the 4-square laundry operation. Those 3 comments are a pattern, and it's worth taking the pattern seriously. Viewers who had the books and had read them already knew there was a female-authored det memoir the video hadn't discussed. They knew there were 2. They knew the earlier video's handling of the MRF period contained a name error. The audience was ahead of the source material. The story of the det had been told predominantly in a male voice, and the people paying closest attention already knew that too. The Guardian confirmed in February 2000 that She Who Dared was one of 3 recent memoirs derived from the experience of the undercover, armed, plainclothes team commonly known as 14 Intelligence Company. 3 memoirs in a cluster around the same period. The female-authored ones were noted at the time of publication. Then they faded. Viewers in the comments section of a YouTube channel were rediscovering them a quarter-century later. She Who Dared, Covert Operations in Northern Ireland with the SAS, was published in 1999 by Leo Cooper, an imprint that had been absorbed into Pen and Sword books, both operating out of Barnsley, South Yorkshire. The first edition is a hardback, 186 pages, illustrated. The ISBN is 978-0-8505-26868. The Imperial War Museum holds a copy. Its catalogue entry lists the creator as George, Jackie, pseudo, author. That parenthetical, pseudo, is the institutional confirmation. Jackie George is a pen name. The real identity of the author hasn't been made public, and nothing in the available record brings it closer to the surface. The book was co-authored with Susan Ottaway. Ottaway was born in Windsor, educated at Sir William Perkins's Girls' School in Chertsey, and worked as a professional writer represented by the Andrew Lowney Literary Agency. Her other books include Sisters, Secrets and Sacrifice, the true story of World War II Special Agents Eileen and Jacqueline Nian, 2 women who ran covert operations in occupied France, and whose contributions to the historical record were also substantially underrepresented for decades after the events. Ottaway had a professional relationship with the stories of clandestine female operators that clearly extended beyond this single commission. She also co-authored The Operators, the memoir of James Rennie, the pseudonymous male 14 int operator whose book appeared in 1996. Ottaway is the linking figure between the male and female published record of the det. She translated both voices into readable form. Whatever the operational content of She Who Dared, It was shaped by a writer who had already spent time inside the world of 14 Intelligence Company, as described by one of its male operators. She understood the vocabulary, the institutional rhythms, the particular black humour of the unit's culture. The operational content in both books came from the operators. The literary structure came from her. The content of She Who Dared, reconstructed from publisher descriptions and book-selling catalogues, covers 2 tours of duty in Northern Ireland during the 1980s. The publisher's description calls Jackie George one of the first women to be used by the army in the fight against terrorism in Northern Ireland. The Waterstones listing specifies the book is illustrated with her own photographs, some of which readers may find shocking. The Amazon listing describes the book as including controversial photographs of actual operations. The photographs demand attention. An operator who had been present during covert operations in 14 Intelligence Company, conducting surveillance in Republican Belfast and almost certainly in other locations across Northern Ireland, had taken photographs during those operations and submitted them for publication. A memoir derived from work that was classified top secret at the time of its conduct, offering visual documentation of what those operations looked like from inside them. That is an unusual claim, and, given what happened next, a significant one. The Guardian published its first piece on She Who Dared on the 4th of February 2000. The headline, "SAS Woman Who Dared Didn't Win." The article reported the book had been submitted to the MOD prior to publication, and that changes had already been made at that stage. It noted the book contained direct criticism of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and that the author objected to what she called the archaic male chauvinism of the soldiers she served with. 3 weeks later, on the 26th of February, The Guardian ran a second piece. The headline, "She Said Too Much." The second article confirmed She Who Dared had been withdrawn after complaints by the Ministry of Defence. The MOD had sought an injunction to prevent further distribution. A spokeswoman for Pen and Sword declined to comment beyond confirming there was a legal problem. The publisher's earlier statement described the author as having become disillusioned and angry at the way situations were being scandalously manipulated by groups to meet their own ends, including the RUC, who had jurisdiction over the army. The sequence. The book was submitted. The MOD made changes. The book was released. The MOD then moved to suppress it. Something in the final version, possibly the photographs, possibly the RUC criticism, possibly the combination, exceeded whatever the vetting had been intended to permit. The specific grounds for the injunction haven't been made public. But the photographs of real covert operations and the direct criticism of an institution the MOD had a relationship with are the most visible candidates for what crossed the line. The headline, "She Said Too Much," describes with compressed precision a female operator who had operational knowledge, committed it to documented form, including photographic evidence, and was stopped by the institution she had served. The institution had cleared a version of the book. Then it changed its mind. The injunction achieved its immediate goal. The book was pulled from distribution. Within a few years, it became a footnote. 25 years later, its second-hand copies trading at over £100, and YouTube comments pointing at the gap. The book itself, the suppressed version, with whatever the photographs showed still intact, hasn't resurfaced in any publicly accessible collection. What remains is the publisher's description, the 2 Guardian articles, the book-selling catalogues, and the IWM's institutional confirmation that the pseudonym is a pseudonym. Sarah Ford published first. One Up, A Woman in Action with the SAS, appeared in 1997 with HarperCollins, 2 years before She Who Dared. One source describes it as the first book written by a female member of an SAS unit, and on the available timeline, that claim is plausible. Ford appears to be the first female DET operator on record to put her experience into print. The Andrew Lowney Literary Agency's website lists the author of One Up as Jane Warren, a professional ghostwriter with more than 18 years of experience at the time of the commission, who had previously ghosted 6 non-fiction titles. Warren had ghosted One Up, A Woman in Action with the SAS for HarperCollins in 1997. The Sarah Ford, whose name appears on the cover, is the operator, not the professional writer. The arrangement mirrors the George Ottaway collaboration exactly: a female operator, a professional writer, a London publisher willing to take on a book derived from classified experience. The book attracted a 6-figure advance. It was serialized in the Mail on Sunday across 3 weeks. The reviews were direct. The Guardian called Ford one of only a handful of women to work in an elite army unit attached to the SAS, conducting surveillance operations in some of the most hostile areas in the province, and described her story as significant, as hers is the first female voice that has reported back from such a secretive area. The Mail on Sunday's description: the astonishing story of the young woman who operated undercover with the SAS, the ultimate woman in a man's world. Sensational. Andy McNabb, reviewing for the Sunday Times, brought the insider perspective that matters. The writer who ghosted the book manages to convey the language and humour of détente life, and the book recreates maximum excitement. Then, in the same review, McNabb acknowledged that the operator whose experience the book recorded had outshot him on the range during selection. McNabb had been through selection himself and served in Northern Ireland. The line isn't a polite compliment. The Daily Mail gave the most concrete biographical description. From the Navy, Ford emerged as the finest shot on the brutal selection course for the secret 14 intelligence company. The literary agency's own description of the book asks how Ford coped with the rigorous physical and psychological training, including simulated terrorist interrogations, the often deadly missions, the relentless pressures of a macho world, and the sex. The commercial framing is obvious. The content underneath it describes a real experience in a real unit. The Mail on Sunday also ran one observation about One Up that is easy to overlook. Her sensational new book prompted the Ministry of Defence to clamp down on SAS personnel writing their memoirs. Whether that clamping down directly preceded or shaped the vetting difficulties that She Who Dared encountered in 1999 isn't established in the public record. Ford's book and George's book exist in the same institutional landscape, separated by 2 years and the MOD's evolving position on what could be permitted to stand. Both pseudonymous, both co-written, both now substantially absent from the popular account of the unit they served. The operational logic that made women necessary to the détente is documented across multiple sources. The 2025 academic paper Invisible Bodies of War, British Servicewomen on Covert Operations in Northern Ireland, published in Intelligence and National Security, and drawing on 21 semi-structured interviews with men and women who served with UK security forces in Northern Ireland, is the most recent and rigorous scholarly treatment of the subject. The fundamental problem the Detet solved by including women was a recognition problem. PIRA's counter-surveillance networks were calibrated for men, specifically for the profile of a male stranger whose behaviour didn't quite fit the social texture of the street. A man sitting alone in a car for 40 minutes on a residential street in West Belfast was a visible anomaly. A man and a woman sitting in the same car, apparently in conversation, apparently going nowhere in particular, read as background. Ordinary. The kind of thing a trained observer passes over. Male-female operator pairs conducted surveillance together, posing as couples. This is confirmed in the Det's documented operational practice and reflected in both published memoirs. The social camouflage a couple provides is straightforward. It's simply the most normal thing on the street. Two men together, in certain contexts, read differently. A single woman read differently in others. A couple reads as background noise, and in a surveillance environment where being read correctly was the difference between completing the operation and being followed home, background noise was the whole point. Women could enter spaces that male operators struggle to justify staying in. A woman browsing in a shop for 20 minutes is a woman browsing in a shop. A man doing the same thing in a small Republican hardware store on the Falls Road or in a cafe in Andersonstown is already being assessed by everyone else present. Social context creates a screen, and the social contexts available to women in an urban Northern Irish environment in the 1980s were different from those available to men in ways that were operationally useful. Attempting to put male operators in female disguise for static surveillance had, to use the 2025 paper's measured phrasing, obvious disadvantages. The 2025 paper also documents the formal operational restrictions placed on female Det operators, and they require direct acknowledgement. Women weren't permitted to operate on their own, going one up in the unit's language. They were barred from manning rural observation posts. They couldn't act as lead handlers, controlling operations from the front. One operator, quoted in the paper, assessed these restrictions as driven by the institution's desire not to dent the egos of these arrogant young men. The operational justification for the restrictions was, by this account, close to zero. The institutional justification was about maintaining male hierarchy within the unit. The restrictions were real. They limited what female operators could do independently. They don't alter the structural fact that certain surveillance missions in Northern Ireland required female presence to be viable at all, and that the women who served in the Det underwent the same selection and training as their male counterparts and deployed into the same operational environment. One selection course drew around 1,000 applicants. 17 were ultimately deployed. The unit across all three detachments comprised approximately 100 to 150 operators in total, standard infantry company strength. Within that number, across both the paired deployments and the social camouflage function that female operators provided, their contribution was structural, not marginal. The 2025 paper documents one further detail that anchors the erasure argument more precisely than anything else in the available record. Women operators' service records, it reports, often reflected their cover roles rather than their actual duties. The paper's example is specific. The clerk in the office who fed the computer. This wasn't a metaphor. It describes a literal administrative practice in which women who had been through the 6-month selection program, who had deployed to Northern Ireland and conducted surveillance in hostile territory, who had been part of the intelligence chain used to plan ambushes, had service records assigning them to notional desk functions. The administrative erasure was built into the official documentation from the start. It didn't happen after the fact. It was how the institution managed the tension between deploying women operationally and not wanting that deployment visible in its own paperwork. At least one woman received a military medal for covert operations with 14 Intelligence Company. The 2025 paper confirms this, an official military award recognizing real operational contribution. No named female 14-int operator's gallantry citation appears in any publicly accessible record, not in the London Gazette, not in any MOD public statement. The award exists in the academic record because researchers interviewed people who served alongside her. It does not exist in the kind of public institutional record that would allow anyone outside that circle to search for it. All debt memoirs, male and female, should be read with calibration, because the conditions of their production shaped what they contain. Both Jackie George and Sarah Ford are almost certainly pseudonyms. James Rennie, the male 14-int operator whose The Operators appeared in 1996, also used a pen name, confirmed in scholarly sources. Operational details in these books, specific dates, specific locations, specific individuals, were routinely altered before publication. Toby Harnden noted in Bandit Country, also published in 1999, that he had used pseudonyms for certain individuals for legal reasons. The vetting process for She Who Dared involved MOD review prior to publication, changes to the manuscript, and then a subsequent injunction after release. Read these books as primary testimony from people who were there, offered under conditions that shaped what could be said. That isn't a weakness of the genre, it's its nature. The name correction from the parent video. The commenter, PSLPOM, flagged a discrepancy involving the surname of the female soldier connected to the MRF period. The name had been given as Walker when it should have been Walk. Public records confirm the correct name. Lance Corporal Sarah Jane Walk of the British Army was involved in the Four-Square Laundry intelligence gathering operation in Belfast. A 2023 academic paper titled A Negotiated Gender Order contains a partial reference to Walk's service in the covert laundry operation, confirming the correct surname independently. Walk served in the MRF, not in 14 Intelligence Company itself. The Four-Square Laundry was an MRF operation, predating 14 INT's formation in 1973. The two organisations are directly connected by institutional lineage. The MRF's functions were transferred to 14 INT after the MRF was stood down, but the unit distinction matters for accuracy. The parent video's source material carried the wrong surname. The commenter had the right one. The surveillance mission of 14 Intelligence Company didn't exist in isolation from what followed it. The intelligence chain had downstream consequences, and those consequences included deaths, and the deaths were sometimes of people who weren't the intended targets. Loughgall is the clearest public case study. 8 IRA members were killed on 8th of May 1987 in an SAS ambush. Anthony Hughes, a civilian driving through the village that evening, was also killed. Hughes had no connection to the IRA operation underway. He was in the wrong place. Det surveillance had contributed to the intelligence that made the ambush possible. The operators who drove the back roads around Loughgall beforehand didn't fire the weapons that killed Hughes. The chain of which they were a part produced his death alongside the deaths it intended. How the specific intelligence that enabled Loughgall was acquired, what combination of surveillance, informer intelligence, and electronic monitoring was involved, has never been fully resolved in the public record. And the suspicion in Republican communities that the precision of the operation reflected something beyond conventional surveillance hasn't been answered. Alleged shoot-to-kill operations in Northern Ireland during this period involved at least 3 distinct organisations: the RUC's E4A Special Support Unit, the SAS, and 14 Intelligence Company. The characterisation is contested. The British state has consistently denied any policy of that name. What the documented record shows is that the intelligence to lethal action pipeline ran across multiple agencies, that debt surveillance fed that pipeline, and that the outcomes included the deaths of people who weren't the intelligence's intended subjects. The Force Research Unit, established in 1980, ran agents and informers separately from the debt's surveillance operations. The 2 organisations were distinct in function, but operated in the same intelligence landscape. Some FRU sources were subsequently killed by the organisation they had been informing on when their identities were discovered. The relationship between informer intelligence and surveillance intelligence in specific operations isn't fully settled in the public record. The debt operated inside a legal framework. Operators were subject to the yellow card rules of engagement. They required RUC warrants before entering properties. Their weapons discharges faced scrutiny and potentially court appearances. That framework was real. It was also a framework designed for a conflict in which the distinction between combatant and civilian was frequently unclear, and in which the intelligence available was rarely complete. The female debt operators navigated the same moral terrain as their male colleagues. The published memoirs, both Ford's and George's, don't appear on the available evidence to engage directly with what the intelligence chain they were part of eventually produced. Whether that silence reflects the author's own choices, the influence of the co-writing arrangement, or the effects of MOD vetting, the texts don't say. It's worth noting as an absence. 14 intelligence companies' functions were absorbed into the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, established around 2005, with a broader remit than Northern Ireland alone. Operation Banner, the British Army's deployment to Northern Ireland, formally ended in 2007. What remained in the popular account was overwhelmingly the male record. Mark Urban's Big Boys Rules, published by Faber and Faber in 1992, was the first serious journalistic treatment of the unit and its relationship to SAS operations. James Rennie's The Operators, from Century in 1996, gave the male operator's perspective. Peter Taylor's Brits placed the debt in the context of the whole covert apparatus. These 3 books, all published before the 2 female-authored memoirs, established the default popular understanding of 14 Intelligence Company. One Up appeared in 1997. It attracted a 6-figure advance, 3 weeks of Mail on Sunday serialization, an Andy McNabb review, and a Guardian commendation. It's now out of print. She Who Dared appeared in 1999, was suppressed by MOD injunction within weeks of release, and currently trades as second-hand copies at prices that reflect scarcity rather than demand. Neither became part of the reference shelf that journalists and documentary makers reach for. Neither appears in the standard popular account of the unit. The academic corrective has been slow. The 2025 paper Invisible Bodies of War represents professional historians now doing the recovery work that the published record never completed. Its 21 interviews, its documentation of the clerk in the office service records, it's confirmation of a military medal that appears. The pattern across British covert operations more broadly is consistent. Published memoirs from the Special Operations Executive, the Second World War organisation that ran agents in occupied Europe, came overwhelmingly from male voices, despite women constituting a significant operational component of the SOE's work in France and elsewhere. The conditions that protected female operators during operations, cover identities, false job titles, pseudonyms, became the conditions that erased them afterwards.
The protection and the erasure used the same mechanism. In 14 intelligence companies' case, the erasure has specific documentable forms. The administrative one is confirmed. Service records assigned false roles to female operators while they were conducting real operations. The institutional one followed. The MOD moved to suppress the most visible female-authored account of the debt, while allowing male-authored accounts to remain in circulation. The market one is simply what happens when books go out of print, injunctions are issued, and 25 years pass. The woman who took photographs during real covert operations, submitted them for publication, and was told she had said too much. Her photographs aren't in any accessible public collection. Whatever they showed is gone, practically speaking, unless a private copy surfaces somewhere. The commenter who pointed at "She Who Dared" in the parent video's comments section, alongside the two others who confirmed the gap and corrected the name error, was marking an absence. They were naming a book that belongs in the standard discussion of 14 Intelligence Company, and asking implicitly why it wasn't there. The audience already knew the story was incomplete. That knowledge came from the books, from having read them, from knowing what they said, from noticing that the video hadn't mentioned them. The books are there, if you can find them. The women who appear in them were there too, in the streets of Belfast, in the surveillance operations that preceded Loughgall, in the debt's 3 detachments across Northern Ireland, doing the watching that the unit was designed to do. They appear in the 2025 academic papers. They appear in second-hand booksellers' catalogues. They appeared in The Guardian twice in February 2000, under headlines that told the whole story if you read them in sequence. She dared, and she said too much. The operational cover was the first erasure. It was the mission. The second erasure is the one still being corrected. Some military histories erase women because they were kept away from the work. This one is stranger. They were close to the work. That was the point. They could stand where a man might be noticed, listen where a soldier might be challenged, and disappear into a street that was watching for someone else. The debt was built on invisibility. Its women paid the highest price for being good at it. History almost missed them. If you want more stories like this one, subscribing will make sure you don't miss the next video.